Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at the Springfield Armory National Historic Site, taking a look at some of the cool prototype American small arms in their reference collection. And today, we have something really special. This is AR-15 number 000006. It is possibly the only one of the original batch of AR-15s that is still in its original as manufactured condition, which makes it a really cool example to take a look at to understand the evolution of the AR-15 design. So the backstory on this begins basically in 1955 with Project Salvo, which is a series of Army experiments trying to come up with better hit probabilities for infantry soldiers. And they're testing a bunch of exotic systems like duplex ammo and triplex ammo, where you have 2 or 3 bullets in one case. So you make one aimed shot and 2 or 3 projectiles go down range. They're testing flechettes, like dart-shaped projectiles instead of bullets. They're testing multi-barreled guns, where you pull one trigger and multiple cartridges fire. And they're testing small caliber, high velocity cartridges. The idea being the higher the velocity, the less the drop over distance, and the longer of a point blank distance, i.e. the farther away a target can be and still get hit without the soldier having to do any sort of manual holdover or correction on elevation. Now, a lot of weird stuff was tested in this program. Not a lot of really successful things came out of it, but one thing that did come out of it was the recognition that small caliber, high velocity cartridges were a source of some real potential. Now, the Army had tested small caliber cartridges way back before World War II. In fact, you look at the 1895 Lee Navy rifle, it's in 6mm. So the military knew about small caliber stuff, and they knew that the terminal ballistics were potentially pretty good. However, larger projectiles were necessary to have payloads of things like tracer material or potentially armor-piercing penetrators, that sort of thing. And the larger calibers had always taken precedence. At any rate, because of the salvo programs, the Army decides, specifically the Commanding General Wyman of Continental Army Command, has the Infantry Board of the U.S. Army put out a request in, I believe it was 1955, for a small caliber high velocity rifle. They wanted a select fire 22 caliber rifle that would weigh no more than 6 pounds, which is a ridiculously light weight, especially for the time. Something that would have the terminal ballistics at least as good as the M1 carbine and would be able to penetrate 10 gauge steel sheet or a steel helmet out to 500 yards. That was the design requirement. Armalite and Winchester both responded to this request. So we'll cover Winchester's .224 caliber rifle in a separate video. Armalite initially proposed a version of their AR-3, which is sort of a traditional hunting style semi-auto rifle. They chambered it for the .222 Remington cartridge, and they called it the Stopette. And it kind of sucked. It was not successful. And they pretty quickly realized, okay, we need something better than that. Let's take our AR-10 rifle, which was then in development and testing in 7.62 NATO, and let's scale it down to .222 Remington. But we want a little higher pressure and more velocity, so they actually developed a cartridge called .222 Remington Special. This used a 55 grain bullet. Long story with the bullet. Originally, the base bullet they were using started off as a 68 grain bullet, which was just the 30 caliber M1 projectile, not M1 rifle, but the M1 bullet, or M1 cartridge, scaled down from 30 caliber to 22. That gave them a 68 grain bullet. They did a little bit of tweaking for overall length and to get the rear boat tail set up the way, in a way that would be more efficient. They end up with a 55 grain projectile. They chamber it in the .222 Remington cartridge, but they're giving it a little higher pressure than Remington, the standard Remington, so they make it a millimeter longer so the two cartridges can't interchange. You end up with .222 Remington Special, which Remington will shortly thereafter rename .223 Remington to sell on the commercial market. That's where the cartridge comes from. That eventually essentially becomes 5.56 by 45 millimeter NATO. It is .223 Remington. Now, they take the AR-10 and they scale it down to this new .222 Remington Special cartridge. And this process is a little more complicated than just like take all the dimensions and multiply them by 0.9 or whatever the difference is, because that Remington Special cartridge actually had a higher chamber pressure than 7.62 NATO. So they had to shrink down all the working parts, but it still had to be capable of handling high pressures, a full rifle pressure, rifle cartridge pressure. The work to do that was done by two engineers at Armalite who were working under Eugene Stoner. Stoner was still working on things like the AR-10. He essentially put this task onto two of his guys, Bob Fremont and L. James Sullivan, or Jim Sullivan. And those two engineers did the work to scale down the AR-10 to create this, specifically this, the AR-15. There were a whole series of other rifles in between there and other AR designations. So yeah, it went from 10 to 15, don't worry about it. Stoner then took their prototype, he took it to General Wyman, demonstrated it to him. Wyman liked the thing, like right off the bat, thought this had a lot of potential. And on May 6th, 1957, so to put it in context, 5 days after the M14 rifle was formally adopted, Army Continental Army Command ordered 10 of these guns for some actual field testing, or some testing at Aberdeen Proving Grounds. Armalite would end up manufacturing 17 of them, and they delivered them just about a year later in 1958, in March of 1958. So let's take a closer look and let me show you what the first AR-15 actually looked like. I think a lot of people don't fully appreciate just how light a 6-pound rifle really is. And this is a rifle that, by the way, was 6 pounds with a loaded magazine. Now, that's actually, let's start with the receiver markings, just to get those out of the way because they're pretty cool. Armalite, the Pegasus from the original Armalite company, AR-15. At this point, it, of course, was still located in Hollywood, California, and this is serial number 6. Now, the magazines used by these first original guns are not actually 20 rounds. If this looks a little bit weirdly long to you, it's because it is. This is actually a 25-round straight magazine. They eventually dropped that to 20 for the production magazines. I should say they also reinforced those production magazines originally with a waffle pattern instead of just the vertical ribs to make them a bit stronger, but that didn't turn out to actually be necessary. Now, much of this is going to be totally familiar to anyone who's familiar with the AR. The most distinctive difference probably is the top charging handle here. So this is taken from the AR-10. That's the AR-10s at the time were using a top charging handle. This is not really intended to be a carry handle. This is intended to be a guard for the charging handle. The advantage of a top charging handle like this is that there is no open slot in the receiver where dirt and grime can get in. There's a dust cover. You close that, and the action is completely sealed up. Compare that to something like an AK, where there's a selector lever that sort of covers the slot in the side, but not very effectively. Other solutions, attempted solutions to this open charging handle slot include things like rubberized covers in guns like the FN Cal or FNC. Like, the top charging handle is a good solution to this problem. So in order to cycle the gun, grab and pull, charging handle does come out the top here, so you can't really do it with your face still on the stock, but that's the original charging handle design. The safety selector was set up a bit differently than what we're used to today. Safe was in the center, push it forward for semi, pull it back for full auto. The stock is sort of made of this woven fiberglass material. One of the general conceits of Armalite was the idea of using basically aircraft materials that were exotic and new to the firearms industry, but materials that a company like Fairchild, the company that actually owned Armalite, Fairchild, was very experienced with using this sort of material, aluminum and fiberglass, because they were used in the aviation industry. The front handguard on these original AR-15s is a single piece. The only way to take it off is actually to tap the pins out and remove the front sight block and then slide the handguard off. Also smaller in diameter than the triangular handguards that would come later. But again, this is copied directly off the early pattern, the the AR-10 from this same time period. If you look at Sudanese or Guatemalan pattern AR-10s, that's the sort of handguard that they have. The barrel is a very thin pencil profile barrel with just a plain muzzle. There wasn't seen to be much of a need for a muzzle brake on this or a flash suppressor, and this was another way to keep weight on the gun down. Let's go ahead and pull this open, take a look at the internals. This is going to open exactly the same way as modern ARs. The rear pin is captive, the front one is actually not captive. The idea here, there we go, it does have a detent, but it comes out. So we can pull that off. Here's our early fire control system. Of course, it does have an auto sear because these are select fire guns. Pull out the buffer. Have a recoil spring and a very early buffer. The front end here is loose and is pinned in place, the cross pin right there. Got a butt plate back there with an Armalite Pegasus logo on it. The bolt comes out just like a modern AR. The charging handle sort of does. It's the same idea. You have to pull it all the way to the back, and then it'll come out of its channel in the upper receiver, but then it has to come out the front so that you have space for the charging handle itself. This has a little detent on the side, spring-loaded, that prevents it from bouncing open under recoil. Rear sight there is the same style that you would get on the later M16A1s. So you've got a rotary dial for windage, you've got a 2-position aperture sight, one for close range, one for long, and the front sight is a round pin that is threaded for elevation adjustment. We can go ahead and take the bolt apart. Instead of a cotter pin, these have a machined split pin right there to hold the firing pin in. Pull out the firing pin, then there we go. Then the cam pin does have a slot on it to tell you which direction the firing pin hole is going. And we can pull out the bolt. The basic design did not change, still hasn't changed to this day. And then the bolt carrier, slightly different detail of its construction. The gas tube is a bit longer than we would expect today. There are no serrations in the side because the manual forward assist has not been introduced to the rifle yet. And there you go. There is one of possibly the only surviving example of a very first pattern AR-15 in its original configuration. All right, so Armalite makes 17 of these rifles. 10 of them, as contracted, get sent to the Army at Fort Benning, Georgia. 4 of those are put into a trial against the brand newly adopted M14. Like, let's see what this rifle can do. Incidentally, of the other 6, 3 went to Alaska for some cold weather testing, and 3 were used for various other demonstrations that I don't have details on. Now, the testing against the M14 went really surprisingly well. Maybe not surprising to Wyman, who clearly saw the potential in this rifle. Maybe not surprisingly to Stoner, who obviously thought there was real potential in this rifle. But to a lot of observers, the idea of a 22 caliber 6-pound aluminum and fiberglass rifle being able to compete with a proper walnut and blued steel M14 was probably a bit surprising. Now, the tests weren't perfect. The rifle was not seen as suitable for adoption in this form, and there were a number of changes that were made to turn this into something quite a lot closer to what we expect to see from the AR-15. So let's take a quick look at the changes that were made after this first trial. So we already mentioned that the 25-round mag would become a 20-round magazine. They decided they did want a flash hider, so the muzzles were threaded and a 3-prong flash hider was added. Not being able to remove the handguard was considered problematic, so they redesigned the handguard to be 2 pieces with a ring in the back holding it on. So you could pull the ring down, take the handguard off. That allowed you to have access to the gas tube as well as the barrel if you needed it. The charging handle apparently overheated. It got really hot to handle after extended firing, and so it was redesigned. Now, they wanted to maintain this enclosed sealed system. And so the way they redesigned it was to get rid of the handle here and move the handle to back here. So the next iteration after this 1958 test was a triangular charging handle back here that had a little locking catch on one side and pull the handle back from there. That's pretty similar to the charging handle we're aware of today, although it would iterate again and get wider to give a better grip later on. A rubber butt plate replaced this original hard polymer of some sort. That might be Bakelite butt plate, but it was replaced by rubber. The trigger was lightened. These original ones have a little bit heavier trigger. They lightened it to about 7 pounds on the next pattern. The barrel was made slightly heavier, about 2 ounces heavier for the entire barrel. Should have mentioned that earlier. Note the original bolt release lever here does not have a lower element on it. They redesigned this later on so that there was a little button down here you could use to lock the bolt open. They also enlarged the bolt release paddle on top, but this is the original first pattern of lever. And then to me, the most interesting change is the change of the selector lever to the system that we recognize today, where this is safe, that is semi, and that is full. And there's a lot of poor lore about why that was changed. The real reason is that when troops were testing these in the field, they would be holding the rifle from the top, and that would have the selector lever dragging on the ground, and it would drag into the full auto position, and then you had the potential for a stick or something to get stuck in a trigger guard and inadvertently fire the rifle. So the switch they made was to reshuffle the selector settings so that if it got dragged like that into the rearward position, it would now be set on safe. So that is why we have the current selectors on the AR-15. So that is the first step in the development of what would become the M16 in U.S. military service. I'd like to give a very big thanks to Springfield Armory National Historic Site for letting me pull this guy out of their reference collection and show it to you guys on film. If you have the chance, if you're here in Springfield, definitely take some time to stop by the museum at Springfield Armory. They have some really cool displays of both American standard issue arms, all the way from the foundation of the country up to the Vietnam War. They also have a bunch of cool prototype and experimental stuff actually down on display in the public museum. So definitely worth your time to check it out. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.